when one is facing their mortality and their death, it's only the connections to inherent value that will matter to you. I promise you that. And many of you who are listening might not believe me. But if there's one thing you believe about what I've said, believe that. Believe that.
And we are live. Dr. Vervaeke, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast.
It's a great pleasure to be here, James. Thank you for inviting me.
The guise of the podcast is a podcast for current startup founders, creators, around creator psychology. But the secret reason of starting the podcast is really for my 3 daughters that are 5, 2, and now a week old. And
wow.
And it's really for them down the road to be able to listen to numerous hours of conversation around managing the inner journey of creating, the side that does not get talked nearly enough about. As a founder myself, you could find 10 blog posts a week on how to recruit or how to build a marketing plan, how to do so many logistical things, but so few of the resources out there are around managing the inner side of creating and building. So getting to chat with you, one of the best known cognitive scientists in the world, and one that I have now listened to about 10 episodes in to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis round 2. So I've already listened to it once through and listening to it again. So I'm all of this preamble is hopefully coming through every listener's speakers, how excited I am for today's conversation. I would love to kick it off with just, do you mind telling listeners a little bit about you yourself, the person, and then also a little bit about what cognitive science is?
Sure. Happy to do so. So I'm an associate professor. In Canada, that means I have permanent status, tenure, at the University of Toronto, and I'm appointed 60% in cognitive psychology, where I teach courses on thinking, reasoning, problem solving, courses on rationality, wisdom, intelligence, mindfulness, and courses on cognitive development. And then I'm 40% cognitive science, where I teach the introduction to cognitive science. And then I also frequently teach a 4th-year course on neuroscientific, cognitive scientific theories of consciousness. And I also teach a psychology course, not every year, but sort of every few years, on the nature and function of the self. So those are the main areas. I do work also on trying to bridge between spirituality and science. And so I did, as you mentioned, a video series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I have a bunch of smaller series where I'm in discussion with people around cognitive science topics like consciousness or the nature of the self, etc. What is cognitive science? Well, I could give you the elevator pitch, but it's not really very representative. Instead, I'm going to pose a problem that we're facing in modernity, and then tell you how cognitive science addresses it. So we talk a lot about the mind, and the problem we're facing with that is we have many different disciplines that talk about it very differently from each other. So neuroscience talks about the brain, and it does fMRIs, right, and things like that. People in artificial intelligence do what they create learning algorithms, etc. And so they're doing something different. People in psychology, they study behavior and they use experiments and statistical methods. Linguists study the mind by studying language and how it works and operates. And anthropologists study the mind by studying culture and the way we interconnect different minds together. Way before we connected the computers together to form the internet, culture was connecting minds together to form collective intelligence, distributed cognition. So here's a metaphor for you. Each one of these disciplines is like a different country speaking its own language and having its own territory. And so they don't do much with respect to each other. Now, the problem with that is, first of all, that means our notion of what the mind is inherently fragmented. And it means when we talk about it, we're often somewhat confused or incomplete. And most importantly, it's unlikely that the brain level, the information processing level, the behavioral level, the language level, and the cultural level have nothing to do with each other. In fact, it's highly probable that they causally influence and interact with each other. And so what you need is a discipline, right, that tries to study the interaction between the different levels by studying trying to get the various disciplines to talk to each other better, to integrate, to coordinate better. And so that's what cognitive science does. It uses, it uses neuroscience and artificial intelligence and psychology and linguistics and anthropology, and it uses philosophy because what philosophy does is often help you build new bridging vocabulary between different domains of discourse. And so what you're doing in cognitive science is basically trying to get these disciplines to form like a synoptic integration where they can influence and impact on each other in an insightful and transformative fashion, so we get closer to a integrated, more complete picture of how the mind works. That's cognitive science.
What does synoptic mean?
Synoptic means seeing it all at once, seeing an overview, get an overarching integrative vision. So you're trying to get a way of a framework that allows you to see the relevance of neuroscience to artificial intelligence or psychology or vice versa. That's the main project of cognitive science. So it's a very exciting area right now.
I feel like it is the area that we're yearning for, because everyone just grows quite thirsty and hungry by only feeding on one specialty or specific discipline without interweaving with the others. There's so many areas that I have so many notes that we're going to go through in this episode, and areas that I'm interested in asking you about. And for listeners, if you enjoyed this conversation at the end, go check out your conversation with Lex Friedman is also phenomenal. And for those that have listened to that or coming here, this should be a complimentary conversation, not too redundant. But one of the first questions I want to ask you is, when I'm listening to you teach, there's so much in there that is granular and beautifully granular when people want to go deep. But if we're to zoom out, what are some of the macro themes, just even within your own work? Doesn't even have to be in a class that's available online for free on YouTube. Thank you so much for that. But if you zoom out, what are some macro themes that you look at and say, man, we culturally look at the mind this way, and nothing in my work adds up to that. This is how we should be looking at it. As this broad stroke question to kick off the conversation, I always think about Einstein telling us in 1921, space-time is one continuum, but none of us actually operate. We stick to our 15th century Newtonian, thought process, psychology, worldview. Are there similar things within cognitive science where you're like, this is the truth, and yet everyone, maybe for the next 50 years, is still going to think this old conventional way?
That's one of the best questions I've ever been asked. I really like that question. So I want to answer it a little bit slowly, if possible.
Go as slow and as long as you want.
I think there's ways in which, we have a Newtonian view of the mind that we are giving up. So let me give you a broad picture. Now that means in order to defend it, I might, and if you need me to, I'll have to drill down. but because it's a broad picture thing. But here's the first thing. Your mind isn't in your head. Your mind is between you and the world in a fundamental way. And that and you shouldn't think of your mind just as between your brain and the world, but the way in which your brain is in your body is fundamentally relevant to the way in which your brain connects to the world. And you have to understand your mind as the intersection of those two connectivities, how you are connected to your body and how you're connected to the world. And that's where the mind actually is. So the mind is this dynamical, self-organizing process. So a good analogy for the mind is like the adaptivity of an organism. Like, is the great white shark well adapted? Well, is that in the shark? Sort of, but no. If I drop it in the Sahara Desert, it dies within seconds, right? It's the proper relationship between that fittedness between the organism and the environment. And that's really, really central, a fundamentally different way of understanding the mind. And then what that then leads to is this connectedness that's central to what the mind is. You experience that in a really existentially important way. This is something for which there's now burgeoning research. That sense of connectedness to yourself, to the world, and to other people, that's meaning in life, that sense of connectedness. That's what makes life worth living, even with all the failures and the foolishness and the futility and the frustrations that we experience. Those connectedness. But we've tended to separate them. But once you see that the mind is fundamentally between you and the world, and also between your brain and its body, then that meaning in life and the functioning of your intelligence are actually deeply interwoven together. So there's two. Third, that means the separation we put in our culture between our cognition and our emotion is a false separation. Your emotions and your cognition are deeply interwoven together in a profound way. Fourth, all of these are related.
I'm going to be taking notes.
Dynamic
if I'm looking away, it's because I'm writing it down.
The very dynamic processes that give you that connectedness to the environment, this is a lot of the work I do around relevance realization. Those very same processes, they're dynamic and complex and recursive and self-organizing. Those very processes that make you adaptively fit, make you perpetually susceptible to complex, recursive, self-organizing self-deception. Which means it's not just a matter of acquiring information. You also have to acquire skills and states of mind and perspectives and traits of character so that you can reliably overcome that self-deception and enhance that sense of connectedness and improve your adaptive intelligence. That's wisdom. That's what wisdom is. And if I ask you where you go for knowledge, you can tell me. Well, where do you go for information? You can tell me. The internet, social media. Where do you go for knowledge? Maybe this expert, that. Where do you go for wisdom?
The
Where do you go to
Upanishads.
cultivate it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that is you asked that in the class, and I had a little bit of a rehearsal of answers.
So what is your answer? I'm interested.
The Upanishads.
Right. Now notice this, right? Notice how you and this is in no way a critique. I just want you to step outside of it and almost see it from a third person perspective. You feel connected to something written in ancient India, probably before the Buddha, probably around 700 BCE, and you find that relevant to your life, right? And this is from the period called the Axial Revolution, and how and why that works for you. That, for me, that's a really fascinating question. And the fact that it seems like, oh yeah, of course, right? And of course it would work, and how it gives me, and notice that the kind of thing it does for you. I mean, so the Upanishads are they're like cognitive science. They're a bridging document. They're bridging between communities of practice. People are practicing various kinds of meditation, contemplation, right? Probably some proto yoga, things like that are going on. And they're also bridging up into a philosophical framework, and thereby linking practices to an overarching framework in a consistent way that you find relevant for you. And think about that. And the thing what we have to address is, for many people, they can't find anything like that in their culture. In the culture, they can't find anything that is, right, guiding them into the practices they should take up for ameliorating self-deception, enhancing wisdom, and also helping them build that into a philosophical framework that integrates them into a comprehensive, intelligible, supportive worldview. That they can't find it, and they're looking for it a lot.
Yeah, I think maybe more interesting than the answer to the question from me to someone like you is, how did I even get there, to picking something up, not to assume what would be interesting to you, but obviously, these are some of the oldest, in terms of continuous study, the oldest continuously studied philosophy in the world. Yet I never heard of the Upanishads until I was 30, maybe 31, and it was really through pure trial and error, and with each trial, really testing, putting pedal to the metal, and trying, not sitting in the first row at the sidelines or 300 rows back from the game, but really getting in the arena.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and realizing, holy shit, that worldview does not work. Is not every ounce of effort to continue the metaphor of trying to drive the car forward, it is going in reverse. And it was through trial and error, and then, to borrow a phrase of yours, relevancy realization. There's a relevancy. Yeah. I think it's one of the things that makes me a pretty good investor, is picking up on things that I really don't consciously know I am connecting, but can somehow intuitively put them together and say, okay, this business or this founder is, I compare it almost to grammar. It's like, okay, these words and the business all fit in the right sequential order, and the right answers for each question, versus I know this is going to make very little sense to many listeners, or maybe even yourself, but it's the only way I've been able to think of, well, how can I just, 10 years into investing, now I'm open with people just saying I can decide about 7 minutes whether I'm going to invest, and I don't exactly know how or why I'm able to do it that quickly. And the best way I could answer it is it's like a grammar. You can, if you speak English and you speak to someone that does not know English or is barely learning, and you're fluent, you're going to pick it up in 2 minutes that they're not fluent. And there's something similar happening with investing in businesses. And I somehow think that mind was used to just see, wow, holy shit, the Upanishads. Good Lord, there's a wealth. This is true. And yet so much of it is paradoxical. And I'm like, that's why it's true, because the surface area stretches over the entirety of my experience that I've had. This speaks to it, and this speaks to it. But total digression that I would love to chat with you about further at another point in time. But there's, that really hit me so hard in your lecture series, where you said you go to your phone or the internet for information, you go to a university for knowledge, but where do you go for wisdom? So like I said, I had that rehearsal for how would I answer?
Good answer.
Such a question. Where would you point someone today that says, man, okay, there's something to the fact that I go, and my pocket has the information. I'm able to listen to so many different podcasts for knowledge. But how do I cultivate wisdom or character? What would your answer be?
Well, my answer would be that you're not going to find it in a set of propositions. I mean, books are relevant, but you're not going to find. That's like, I'll pick another Indian doctrine. Only reading the Kama Sutra, you won't really understand what it's about until you actually practice it. That's because this is part of also the cognitive science. Our culture has tended to focus on propositional knowing as what knowing is. But most of our knowing is what I call non-propositional knowing. We can go into more detail if you want.
Would you mind? I would love for you to outline the different forms of knowing for listeners.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, propositional knowing is the one we're very familiar with. Proposition, right, is a statement that you can value it for true or false. It generates beliefs. You believe this is true. You believe it's false. It's knowledge that. I know that cats are mammals. And it's stored in your semantic memory. You know that cats are mammals, and that's stored as a fact in your semantic memory. And that's very different from procedural knowing. Procedural knowing is knowing how to do something, knowing how to swim, knowing how to catch a football, knowing how to kiss somebody you love, and knowing how to kiss them when they're happy and knowing how to kiss them when they're sad. And all of that built out. And so this is knowing how. It doesn't result in beliefs that are true or false. It results in skills that apply or not. So I take it that you're not trying to use your skill at swimming right now. It doesn't apply. It doesn't fit, right? You have a distinct kind of memory for procedural knowing. It's called procedural memory, and you can these two memories can operate. They talk to each other, but they operate independently from each other. So you can lose a lot of propositional knowledge, like in Alzheimer's, for example. You lose a lot of facts, but you can still remember how to play the piano because it's procedural knowing. It's knowing how to do something. Now, and the reason I'm doing them in this order is, as I talk about it, each one is dependent on the next one. So you have to know how to do a lot of things before you can properly acquire propositional knowing, right? And so now you have procedural knowing. Now below that is perspectival knowing. That's what it's knowing. That's knowing what it's like to be in a perspective. You have a perspective right now. You know what it's like to be you here now in this state of mind, and what is salient to you, what is backgrounded and foregrounded. You have a perspective. And perspectives aren't true or false, and they're not skills. We can study them actually now much more carefully because we have virtual reality. And what you're looking for in a perspective, think about a video game. What do you want from a video game? You want to feel like you're really in the video game. You want that sense of presence. And that's what we look for in perspectival knowing. We look for that sense of presence. And this is not stored in semantic memory or procedural memory. It's stored in episodic memory. So when I ask you, where did you learn that cats are mammals? You won't be able to tell me, probably. But if I ask you, can you tell me what you did in your last birthday? Then you'll go into your mind and you'll reconnect the perspective, the particular scene, where you are, how you saw it, what was salient. That's your episodic memory, right? And so that's your perspectival knowing. Below that is participatory knowing. This is the knowing that results from how physics and biology and culture have co-shaped you and the environment so you fit together. Right? So, for example, because of physics and gravity, this and me fit together. Because of my biological evolution, I got this, and I was able to make tools. And because of culture, right? And so this is graspable to me, right? And this is not, the graspability is not in my hand or in this object. It's called an affordance. This is from Gibson, one of the great psychologists, right? So participatory knowing gives you, right? It gives you identities that you assume and identities that you assign. I'm a grabber. This is a bottle, and affordances open up between them, and you're doing it all the time. For example, I assume you're taking your identity as a public figure, a podcaster, and you're talking to me in a certain way, and I'm taking on my role as a cognitive scientist. I'm not taking on the role with you that I would take with my partner. That would be weird and creepy, right? And so certain affordances are available to me, certain affordances are not available to me, because the agent arena relationship is constantly shifting. That's your participatory knowing. It generates affordances, and the affordances give you a sense of belonging, a sense of agency. And the form of memory that's associated with is this very strange kind of memory you call your sense of self. You have a sense of self, a sense of identity. And so all of these kinds of knowing are very fundamental to your intelligence, to your cognition. We have overemphasized the propositional at the expense of the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory, even though most of your ability to be adaptively fitted to the environment and find meaningful connection is actually being carried on by the non-propositional knowing. So you need, to go back to your question, you need an ecology of practices. You need an interlocking, dynamical system of mutually correcting and constraining practices that addresses the procedural skills, the perspectival states of mind, and the traits of character, and gets them properly organized in order to cultivate wisdom, in order to deal with self-deception, in order to enhance meaning in life.
So
sorry, was that too long of an answer?
No. I would love every answer to be as long. I think honestly, this is the long form medium. If people are coming here, it's the audience that will say a 3-minute answer from someone like you is way too short. So I want you to go as deep and articulate as you'd like, because even in the words chosen, there's so much to potentially unpack for someone that's coming across your work or thinking about these things for the first time. And to recap what you said, I'll be taking notes throughout the episode for listeners, really for my sake, but for listeners as well. So propositional knowing. So there's 4 types of knowing that you're talking about within cognitive science, far beyond what we conventionally just think of.
Yes.
There's knowing and there's not knowing. There's propositional, which is knowing that.
Yeah.
There's procedural, which is knowing how. There's perspectival, which is knowing what it's like to be ... You in the chair, or you on the subway. And then there's the participatory knowing, which what would be the shorthand for that?
Which is knowing by being. Knowing by being. You're knowing by being a certain kind of entity, by being a certain kind of agent. It's knowing, right? It's knowing by being this way, being this self, being this lover, being this friend. And so you know this by how that being is being transformed when it's entering into participatory relationships. So there's a sense in which, of course, I know my partner, I have beliefs about her, right? But if you ask me, is that how I really know her? That'd be, wow, that's so superficial, right? I have skills for how to interact with her, but that makes her sound like a problem. That's certainly inadequate. I know what it's like to be with her. I have that perspectival presence, and she's very present to me, and I'm very present to her. But there's a participatory knowing. I've bound how I'm becoming me, if you'll allow me to talk like a Hallmark card for a second, right? Through her. So how I am becoming a self is through her, and she is becoming who she is through me. We have a participatory knowing. We are participating in each other's identity and character formation, and that's how I know her, and that's how she knows me. And of course, that's a crucial feature of love. It is that kind of participatory knowing.
This is a whole line of questions I would love to, a road that I'd love to go down, and especially around your phrase, ecology of practices. Are you saying that those 4 come together for wisdom, that developing each is the development of wisdom?
Yeah. Yes, I think what you need to do is, I mean, and this goes back to Plato. Part of what wisdom is to properly understand each one of them and how they operate, so you can deal with the kind of self-deception that is endemic to each, You also want to be able to deal with the self-deception that is caused by conflict or misalignment. And so what you want to do is you want to, as deeply as possible, align these and get them helping each other, sort of the Buddhist metaphor of befriending each other to help each other reduce the self-deception within each. So the way I can use my procedural and my perspectival and my participatory to correct my propositional, vice versa. So I'm trying to use them to form a almost like a little internal community where they are aligning and affording, but also correcting and constraining each other with respect to how am I most deeply ratio religio, how am I in a really profound, best kind of connectedness to myself, to other people, and the world.
One of my teachers, Joseph Emmett, who's been on the podcast before, has been teaching Advaita Vedanta for 25 years. He talks about the concept of satsang within Vedanta, same as Sangha within Buddhism, which is community of the good,
yes.
or community of truth. And he talks about it in terms of it's not just you and 10 other people, 5 other people, 1 other person. It's what you read. It's what you eat. It's what you watch on TV.
Yes.
That is the community of the good. And it sounds
well
like
said.
In this development of each of these, it is a conscious choice to develop them, and a conscious choice of a deliberate, maybe choice is a better word, deliberate choice to not only develop them, but to continually foster their development with each further deliberate choice. Go into what you eat, to what you watch.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, you have to, again, if you understand cognition as the mind between you and the world, and between you and your body in a deep and profound way, that's what you have to do if you want to deeply transform it. And when they are doing that, I mean, think about, when do you really understand something? You have to have all of these, and you're getting the relevance of each one to each other. Like, think about trying to really understand a person and you don't have the participatory relationship. You don't get it, or you don't have the perspectival, or you don't have the right skills for interacting with them, or you might not even have the right set of belief. But when they're all coordinated and you grasp the relevance of each one of these to each other, then you can deeply understand what they are co-focused on. You get that profound ability to understand something. And I think that's also a tremendous feature of wisdom. When we talk about wisdom, we're talking about people who have insight, profound understanding. They can deeply fit themselves to a situation. They can shape their agency to the arena within which they are found. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about right now, and that's what you get when you get. I like that model, by the way, of that internal community and the external community. Thich Nhat Hanh said really beautifully, and this is sort of a slogan for me: the next Buddha is the Sangha. We have to be paying attention much more to the way in which these communities of cognition work, as opposed to just single systems, single people, etc.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard the probably apocryphal story of his followers went up to the Buddha and asked, "What's more important? What is most important? You, the Buddha, the Dharma, the teaching, the truth, or Sangha, the community?" And without hesitation, he said, "Sangha." The community is the most, and that it's obviously it's a bit. It's a bit unpredictable for someone living that ideal in the minds of these followers to say that it's actually not in him. It's in that community is the most important aspect. I wanted to ask you. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say that's generally a feature of wise people. They get out of the way of the wisdom. They don't try and stay in front of it and make people look at them in order to see the wisdom.
2 questions for you on that front. One is, what is wisdom, and how would you define it for us lay people? And then also, when you say that the mind is between you and the world, who is you?
That's a great question. Let's do the first question. I think that wisdom is the ability to cultivate rationality, but in the ancient sense of ratio. We've reduced rationality to logicality. That's a mistake. When I'm talking about rationality, I'm talking about you use your intelligence to solve your problems, but rationality is about dealing with the self-deception that emerges as you try to solve your problems and use your intelligence. And right, so rationality is like, how am I deceiving myself within my propositional processing or my procedural processing or my perspectival processing or my participatory processing? How am I deceiving myself? And then I have to cultivate a rationality for each one of those. But then I have to cultivate a ratio. Think of the word ratio, rationality, rationing. I have to come up with the proper proportioning of each one of these within any particular circumstance. And how do they integrate to give me that understanding? So I need a meta rationality for coordinating all the individual rationalities. So I need sort of a rationally self-transcending rationality. Each one of them is contributing to this overall alignment, but the overall alignment is helping each one, right? Procedural rationality, participatory rationality get better. And so that the bottom up from each rationality to the ratio between all of them, and the top down between the ratio of all of them, and how that helps each one of the propositional rationality, procedural, that bottom up, top down, self-transcending rationality, that's what I think wisdom is. This comprehensive ability to improve our capacity for overcoming self-deception and also enhancing that connectedness that is getting lost or distorted or severed by the self-deception. So wise people have that kind of capacity to comprehensively, dynamically, bottom up, top down, overcome self-deception, bottom up, top down, enhance meaning in life.
For a creator that's listening to this, so let's say they run a business of 10 employees and they're in their mid-20s, and this is their first time to run a business. What's an example of self-deception, that irrational mind using this? I love that qualification of rationality is not just, it's not a logical
logic.
It's not logic. It's not logic based, but it is in overcoming self-deception. What would be an example? And then please.
Yeah. I'll give you one organizational example. There are many. This is not exhaustive. This is just exemplary. So as you build an organization, you tend to create a hierarchical structure. And the problem, and we have good evidence for this, as you go up a hierarchical structure, your ability to take the perspectives of other people goes down reliably. Your ability to take other people's perspective goes down reliably. And what's interesting is, I participated in the Wisdom Consensus paper in 2019. We got a whole bunch of the researchers together, and we tried to hammer out what are some of the core features. That meta-perspectival ability, that ability to take other people's perspectives, not just take it, but internalize it and use it to criticize your own thought and make it part of your own thinking, and also, right, to allow other people to adopt adopt yours. That meta-perspectival ability reliably goes down as you move up a hierarchy. And so you have to do things preemptively to prevent that, because if you just rely on your sense of, I know what other people are thinking, you're engaging, very probably, empirically based, you're engaging in a form of self-deception. We all overestimate how good we are at picking up on other people's perspectives, and then that particular bias gets exacerbated as we move up some kind of social hierarchy.
It reminds me of one of my favorite startup books, is "What Got You Here Won't Get You There," and the synopsis is very, it's in the title of just the things that got you to running a company of 10 people, 50, 150 people, is probably through what you're talking about, of you telling yourself, I'm really good with people, I'm really good at seeing their perspective. And yet what stops you from moving to that next echelon is this self-deception that, yeah, you might have been good at that with 5 people, 8 people. Shit, you might have been good at that, moderately, and then it was just the risk, the bet you took, and it worked out in spite of not being that good at it, but you succeeded in spite of it. But it's that thought that you just gave as an example, that I'm really good at this. It's that self-deception that will keep you from reaching that next rung of the ladder. And it seems to be, I would love to lay this example on your lap and see how you'd chop it up as a cognitive scientist. It seems to be within starting companies and building things that it's not just you need to do more work in an area that you thought you didn't need to do work in, that you thought you were already proficient in. It also seems to be, holy shit, that skill set that you have, if you continue to do that work, that's the very thing that will suffocate the organization at 15 people, at 20 people. And there seems to be this very strange crucible that each founder has to go through, where the thing that they're really good at is the thing that they really have to stop doing. And it's so damn hard, but I would love to see how you would chop that up.
But James, that's a specific instance of the very thing I said, which sounded abstract, but now you made it concrete. The very processes that make you so adaptively intelligent are the very same processes that make you prone to self-deception. I mean, it sounds like a Zen koan, but your greatest strengths are also your greatest weaknesses. And that's why, like when you're training, you can't have a panacea practice. You can't have, I'll just do these one or two things that I've always been doing. And I even say that in the so-called spiritual domain. I'll just meditate my way in. No, you can't. There is no panacea practice, because your cognition is so complex and recursive and largely hidden to you that you need multiple practices that are like addressing different parts of you and are put together like an ecology. They check and balance each other in powerful ways, because we can take anything and we can push it too far. There is no panacea practice. It's the same thing, but that thing you're saying, right? It's like, I do that. I'll do this with people. I'll say, okay, what kind of tree grows from an acorn? And well, an oak. And what do you call the gray stuff floating up from a fire? Well, it's smoke. And what am I doing? Oh, that's a stroke. And what's this? A choke. And what do you call the white of an egg? And everybody says, oh, that's the oak. That's the yolk, right? And it's like, no, right? It's not the yolk. It's the white of the egg. And the problem that is they kept hearing the oak sound, and then they latch onto that. And as long as the environment doesn't change, that will work. But the very thing that empowered their connection also makes them prone to not seeing when the environmental change has occurred, right? And so that's exactly the thing. And so as you move into a more complex environment, you have to think about complexifying your cognition. You have to think about differentiating it and then reintegrating it in order to deal with the order of magnitude in complexity you're dealing with. And what we're tempted to do is instead double down on what has worked for us before. But that's not how biological systems evolve and adapt, right? And you have to, so think about evolution. How does evolution work, right? You have to periodically introduce significant variation and then kill most of it off, but select some of it in that goes into your reproductive cycle. And I know because I talk to people in the business world sometimes talk this way, but it's, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to be helpful, not harsh. I hope that's...
No, be harsh. Be harsh. Being harsh is the most helpful.
They're doing it at the propositional level. They're saying they think by uttering these words and even agreeing that it's true, that they have cultivated the skills, the states of mind, and the traits of character that actually afford this. Now, one of the great lessons we can learn from the spiritual traditions is they have learned to challenge that. They have learned to challenge people who talk the talk, but as it goes, aren't able to walk the walk. It's a different kind of transformation you have to go through. And so, yeah. Sorry, I'm getting excited about. Think about the reason why people don't give up, right? The things that are working. It's not just that they're working. they have identified with them. They have identified themselves with that particular skill set, that particular set of stories of their success. That's who I am. That's what I am. And so giving it up isn't just the way you put down a hammer. You're confronting the possibility that if you really want to undergo this transformation, you have to think about seriously transforming your identity in a profound way in order to move to that next step. And the people who are capable of doing that are the people who will go through the long-term ceteris paribus, because bad stuff happens unpredictably. But ceteris paribus, those are the people who will see the long-term success. It's the same thing in a relationship or a marriage. You have to be able to go through periods of considerable identity death and recovery in order for the marriage to be a long-term marriage. This is what I mean about the non-propositional stuff is so crucial. Sorry, I'm getting too excited. I got to comment.
I think this is going to be the only conversation that, at least on this podcast, that talks about the different types of knowing, and how our culture overemphasizes the propositional. I couldn't agree more that it de-emphasizes the participatory, and it seems to discourage it at every turn. I'll give you an example. I've got a little nephew, and in trying to learn the guitar at 11, he can look up on YouTube within an hour of interest and see a 9-year-old that is incredible.
Yes.
And he's like, well, shit. Okay, I'm not going to be that. This is really hard.
Exactly.
And so I'm not going to participate. I'm going to just... Yeah. I was chatting with 2 young kids at a baseball game recently. I asked them... one of my friends is one of the first guest on the podcast, built a streaming platform called Twitch for video games. And I asked them, so do you guys watch Twitch? And I said, what's your favorite video game? And they said Fortnite. And so maybe a year ago, and they said, I was like, oh, so do you watch it on Twitch? And they said, yeah. And I said, are you guys pretty good at it? And they said, we don't play. This is a freaking video game. The lowest stakes possible. And they're saying that they don't participate. They would rather sit and watch others participate in. And it's not mainstream media discouraging this. It's all of these soft interactions that seem to tell us, oh, there's no point. There's no point. What's going on there that in our society that seems to discourage these other forms of knowing, and maybe starting with that participatory knowing, and how can we individually counteract that?
Well, that's a long historical answer to that, and that's what I take a great deal of time to do on Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, how we got into this particular place. What I can say to you is we have developed a model of method without transformation. This is Descartes, cogito ergo sum Descartes, the scientific revolution. It comes to an epitome in one of his sort of intellectual descendants, Leibniz, the idea that I'll just get a calculus and I'll be able to calculate all my problems, and we'll be able to resolve all the world's problems that way. It's an intoxicating dream. Now, if you go before sort of the scientific revolution and Descartes, you have a much different notion of how you get knowledge. Some knowledge can be done through method, but there was the idea that a lot of knowledge, a lot of truths are only disclosed to you when you're prepared to go through long-term profound transformation. So we had places like monasteries for the cultivation of wisdom. I'm not advocating that we build monasteries or things like that. But what I'm saying is people understood, wait, there's certain kinds of ways of being connected to myself, other people, and the world that require long-term, profound, transformational practice. And we've lost that, and we've tended to think of, what I can do is I need a method or a technique. And if I just have the right method or technique, I can conquer the universe, I can conquer the world. And what we're seeing, I would argue, in cognitive science and philosophy and psychology, is the realization that that's not fundamentally true. I just taught a course today, a class in a course on cognitive development, right? And here's a new thing. You asked me for big themes. We used to think, you sort of develop and then you're an adult and you're done. That's the wrong model. If cognition is inherently self-organizing, dynamic, like I'm talking about here, there's no deep difference between how it develops and how it functions. It functions by developing and it develops by functioning. The two are interwoven together. Only when significant self-organized transformation, self-transcendence, will most of your capacity be realized. And we have put that aside with the model of we're sort of done when we're an adult, and what we do is we acquire the methods and the techniques, and then that's sufficient for solving a whole host of problems. And that is turning out to be very deeply problematic for us as a society and as a culture. And so what we have to remember, well, I'll actually, the ancients said it really best. As the child is to the adult is to the sage. You understand that you are way beyond the self-deceptive limitations of a child. Then you had to go through significant transformation. You had to mature. Stop thinking that's done. Really. And try to hear more than the proposition. Stop thinking that's done. You still have to not just acquire techniques and information, you still have to continue maturing. And I mean that in a profound way. The degree of maturation between the adult and the child is the degree of maturation you should still be pursuing now between you and the sage. That's why you read the Upanishads. That's written by people who are, and I'm not insulting you, James, right? Any more than I think I would be insulting. You are reading from people who have a kind of spiritual maturity that you are properly aspiring to and are demanding from you significant transformation.
It's not insulting at all. It's how dare you not say I'm on par with the Buddha, John. This conversation is over. When you say the word "you," what do you mean? Especially in this, both the two contexts you've mentioned it. One in maybe the high-minded ideal of the mind being between the world and you. Who is the you behind the mind? And then also you mentioned of a pitfall we can fall into as creators is this misidentification. I would love to explore that part as well, but starting with just who is the you behind the mind?
So, I mean, I did an extended series with Greg Enriquez and Christopher Mastropietro called The Elusive I, capital I, but punning on the I, about the nature and function of the self. I do quite a bit of work on this. And again, if people want more granular arguments, they can drill down into that series. So I'm just going to do the 30,000 foot view, or 30,000 meter view. I'm a Canadian. I should use the metric system. Right. So again, you have to stop thinking of the self as sort of a homogeneous blob inside of you, this single sort of thing. You have to understand the self as very dialogical rather than monological in nature. Part of yourself, for example, is the way in which you can get the different kinds of knowing to talk to each other. But there isn't a you above that. That you emerges out of how they talk to each other. And then the talking to each other then has effects on how they talk to each other. Let me give you an example. You and I can have a conversation, and you and I participate in it. And I do this with dialogical practices. Hey, and you've been in those conversations, right, that take on a life of their own, and they go ways that you couldn't predict, and they take you to places you couldn't have gotten to on your own, and the other person says the same thing. And it's like the conversation took on a life of its own. It's not independent from you. It emerges from both of you, but it also has top-down influences. Does that work as a metaphor?
For sure.
That's what your self is like. Yourself is like a conversation that emerges from these different kinds of knowing, these different processes. It's a conversation that starts to take on a life of its own, but it's never a separate thing. It's always emerging from them and then also influencing them. And that's what yourself is. It's this very complex dialogical process. Many kinds of therapy are now zeroing in on this because they're using dialogical processes in order to get access to the psyche. So you have to think, let me point to one important dialogical aspect. And this goes to, deeply influenced by the work of my friend Charles Stang and the notion of the divine double. You are in continual, and then I want to talk about a kind of experiment around this, just to make it really concrete for people. You are in continual aspirational dialogue with your future self. So, now let's make this very practical. You go into a bunch of academics, people who are supposed to be the cream of the crop, and you give them the best arguments and the best evidence that they should start saving for their retirement right now. You allow them to ask any questions, raise any objections they have, you answer them all, you get them all to agree they should start saving money right now for the retirement. You come back in 6 months and none of them are saving reliably. Now you change it. You say, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to imagine your future self as a family member that you love and you feel responsible for and you care about. And I want you to do that every day. I want you to imagine that. You come back and you find two things. The people that do that are saving, and the more vividly they can imagine their future self and enter into this dialogical relationship with it, the more money they have saved. Reliably. That's what I mean about how yourself is inherently dialogical in nature.
Almost sounds like you're saying the self is its own ecology.
Yes, and that's why you need to address it with an ecology of practices. Exactly.
Do you mind articulating what your ecology of practices are, and even get into the granular, like, is it daily, is it weekly, is it monthly? I would love that.
Daily. So most of my practices are daily. There's some practices that I do more, not as regularly because they depend on meeting with other people. But I can point people to the workshops that Guy Senstock and Christopher Master Pietro and I teach, where we take people through an entire pedagogical program to create an ecology of practices. But so, for example, right now I've hurt my hip, but every day I usually begin with doing some, Tai Chi, and I do three versions. I do a fast striking form, I do a sword form, a weapons form, and I do a slow form. And so that's because you want to have a moving mindfulness practice. Then I move in and I do a very deep kind of meditative practice. And then I do a contemplative practice, because you want to have, so not only do you want to have opponent processing between movement and stillness, you want to have this self-correcting relationship between meditative practices and contemplative practices. And then I will typically, when that's done, I do Lectio Divina. This is a way of reading a text transformatively rather than informatively, and it involves sort of interacting with the text using some of these imaginal techniques I talked to you. I'll do that. I will also do practices.
What does that look like? What could you get more granular on that? I think there are listeners to this podcast that really want to know almost exactly what you mean and what that looks like if someone was 5 feet from you watching you and able to hear what's going on in your mind.
Well, part of it is also, I can point, I'd encourage people, I've got lots of videos where I'm demonstrating this, and I'm going to be demonstrating this in the new series I'm releasing. But what it would look like is I would pick up a passage. Let's say I'm reading a passage from Spinoza. I don't read very much. I read maybe a paragraph. Mm-hmm. I find something in that paragraph that really catches me. And hopefully not because I can completely explain to myself why it catches me. It says, that seems to be the key thing leaping out at me, somehow grabbing me, the gist of that part of the text. Then I chant it, and I chant it like in the way I do chanting within within meditation. I sort of chant it to myself, and then I try to enact any imagery it might have in it. It might be saying, understand, God is not God. Here's one that really grabbed me one time. It's like, and God, and by God, Spinoza means what we currently mean by God and what we currently mean by nature, and see through both of them to something beyond that would integrate them together. So, but he says God does not have abstract ideas, and it's like, oh my gosh. And you get this real. And so, what does that mean to enact it? Well, whenever I try to understand sort of ultimate reality, I find myself moving in this abstraction, and that's inevitable. But then you realize, but that ultimate reality is not an abstraction to itself. And what does that like? And then you're sort of like, what is that provoking in me? What is it like to not experience that abstractly, but in my guts, in the very fiber of my being? And then I'm really trying to get the perspective that Spinoza had when he uttered that, and I try to, as much as I can, presence hit that perspective, and then I try to open my eyes and contemplate what is it like to see and be in a way from that perspective? What is shown to me from the world? What bubbles up within me as I engage with that, as I sort of presence Spinoza's living perspective? This is a transformative way of reading a text.
I'm smiling as you're talking because it's wild that you describe it that way. It's I've got another podcast project with the aforementioned Joseph Emmett, my teacher. That's yoga for your intellect. It's intellectual yoga. It is Advaita Vedanta, and our teacher, maybe the best known proponent of Vedanta living today, Swami Parthasarathi, talks about you must make the objective wisdom subjective. It cannot stay objective. It cannot stay abstract.
Yeah. And
And the way to do that, so touches on one thing you're saying and also touches on the method. And the way to do that is in Vedanta, there's the phrase is Shravana Manana Nididhyasana. So it's listening, reflection, experience. And in that order of there's listening or there's learning, there's reading. And it's usually about a paragraph or two. Might be 2 verses of the Gita.
Yep.
And then it's reflection, and it's often said reflection being 100,000 times more powerful than listening. That almost like listening is, to your point, it's almost meaningless if there isn't, did you say transformational?
Yeah, and you really try and enact it imaginally, right? Right. You have to remember that this is another problem in our culture. We've reduced imagination to the imaginary. The point of imagination is to picture things that aren't present. The imaginal is to use the imagination to enhance your perception of reality. So when I'm teaching Tai Chi Chuan and I'm telling people, imagine that you're standing in a river and your knees to your feet are sinking in the mud, and your knees to your abdomen are like the flowing water that has that flexibility and that force. And then from from sort of your belly button to your head, this is like the air. It's airy. It's very light. When people enact that, it allows them to perceive otherwise imperceptible, subtle patterns of posture, of dynamic balance, of mind-body integration, of how you're positioned with respect to the world. That's imagination for the sake of enhancing perception. It's like with the people in the experiment, imagining their future self, so they enter into a dialogical and real relationship with it. That is that you have to do that imaginal enactment of the text and let it really provoke in you and evoke things from you, and try and get the perspective in which that becomes coherent for you, so that you understand, oh, this is what Spinoza was seeing when he was saying that.
That movement piece is wildly under-discussed in our culture. It is, we are so, well, at least I know for myself, so heady, so in my mind,
Yes.
so in the
Yes.
intellectual side of things, and and I have paid the price the last 2.5 years, 3 years. I've had terrible lower back pain from essentially a life of neglect of the body, and just thought, oh, my thing will be in the intellectual side of life. And I think in one of your lectures you talk about Plato. That was his nickname for broad-shouldered, and he was massive human, but also a very competent wrestler, and it just made me think that is certainly not the representation. It's not the idea that I had in my head of a philosopher, of someone as you also say this so beautifully, that Western civilization stands on 2 feet. I think you said Plato and Christ. Is that correct?
Plato in the Bible. Yeah,
Plato in the Bible.
Yeah.
And so it just underscores how important this figure is in Western civilization, and he was quite the competent wrestler.
But James, you see that notion that it's in your head, right? And the way you said it, like, so here, good cognitive science, what's called 4E cognitive science, the skills, right, you build for navigating your physical environment and manipulating articulating. Think of what that word means. It originally means your joints are articulated, right? Like articulating your motions. That gets exapted, that gets repurposed by your brain for how you move through conceptual space. I continue to do, but when I first started doing Tai Chi Chuan, the first 3 or 4, and I was doing it very religiously, like 3 or 4 hours a day, and going to the dojo like 4 or 5 times a week, and I was getting all of this amazing stuff happening that I thought was so amazing, like the days where you're as hot as fire and as cold as ice and all that stuff, and but I was too focused, because what happened is people were coming up to me, like, and I was in graduate school at the time, and they were saying, "What are you doing? You're so different. You're way more flexible in your conversation, right? You're much more balanced in how you're interacting, right? And you're able to adjust and adapt as things shift. You're less rigid and brittle than you used to be." And I realized, oh my gosh, the Tai Chi was permeating many different domains of my life, intellectual domains, and percolating through levels of my psyche. And for me, that was, that's a marker. So I learned 2 lessons, and I passed this on to my students. Pay more attention to other people's observation of your transformation than your own, introspective awareness, and pay attention to if that's indicating how broadly and how deeply what you're practicing is permeating and percolating that, right? And if you think that you can, I was just reading a thing today, so much is coming to my mind. If you want, so you get old people in their late 60s, and you give them a program in which they're doing cognitive and physical practices integrated, and what you can find is that they will show the attentional performance better than or equal to 20-year-olds if they're doing this program, right? This is what I mean about how embodied your cognition is. If you leave out the movement, you leave out a powerful way in which you cognitively develop. Look, you have your cerebellum, right? Your cerebellum has more neurons in it than your neocortex. We talk about how the frontal lobes expanded during evolution. You know what area of your brain expanded more? The cerebellum. Why? The cerebellum is just about sensory motor balance. The cerebellum has been exapted. It still does that, but it's been repurposed. The way my tongue has been repurposed for speech. The cerebellum has been repurposed to handle massive complex contingency between variables. So you have a cerebellar cortex loop like this. When you're doing things like Tai Chi Chuan, you are cultivating and enhancing that. When you're sitting on your butt for 8 hours, not moving around, that is atrophying, and your cognitive flexibility is reliably going down. This is why it's not in your head. It's between your brain and your body, and between your embodied brain and the world. That's where your mind is. And if you don't situate that properly and cultivate it responsibly, you will lose your cognitive capacity.
That's such a great argument for any creator, business leader that thinks going into the gym or going to take time for to learn surfing or Tai Chi sounds phenomenal, or to really devote themselves into learning yoga. That stuff seems like such a luxury when you feel like your work requires problem solving in a conference room, especially right now in an economic climate that is so unpredictable. You've just had layoffs, and it sounds like you're saying that's one of the most critical mistakes you can make, is thinking the work you are doing, the important work you're doing, belongs in a chair. And it's that's. We've got this. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, and this internet lag, I apologize, is leading to a slight overspeak. But I learned last week that if you want to increase, two interesting things that combined in one 7-day span was, one thing was that testosterone helps you dive into work, go into pain and a challenge, and actually seek it out. And increasing testosterone can do that. And then within 2 or 3 days, also learned that just punching in the air can increase your own natural production of testosterone. So you saying within Tai Chi a sword? Did you say sword work and?
Oh yeah, also striking. So
striking?
I do Fijin, which is striking form. I do a sword form, and then I also do a slow form. But every move within the slow form is multi-apt for different applications. So what you do is you do all these forms, and then what you want to do is, when you're actually doing something, you want to get into sort of like sparring or, God forbid, fighting, because everybody loses. Even if you win a fight, you lose. But you want to get into like jazz, where it just comes out of you and you're constantly innovating because you have practiced cultivating the flow state within each one of these forms.
Yeah, it certainly fits perfectly with those little factoids of last week. Because one of the things coming through my mind in our conversation is, man, John, this just sounds like so much work. You've got the propositional, you've got the participatory, you have the perspectival, you have all of these different, you've got the procedural to develop, you've got the ecology of practices that will develop those. It seems like so much work. And so the question that was going through my mind maybe 5 or 10 minutes ago was, where the hell do we start? And if it's not a monastery, if it's not going to a place to develop wisdom.
Well, first of all, I want to reply to it's so much work. It was a lot of work going from being a child to an adult. That took a lot, right? And would you have not done it because of so much work? I mean, would you rather be a child?
No,
perfect
response.
You have to pay attention to, right? We're talking about a qualitative change, not just a quantitative expenditure. And what you have to ask yourself is, are there qualitative changes that are worth the quantitative expenditure? And of course, I gave you an example of one where you clearly agree, yes, it is. I'm glad I put all that effort in, to becoming an adult, because my capacity to deal with the world would be so truncated if I stayed a child. So think about the degree to which you might be making that argument. We might be well, I don't want to put in all that effort. But it's like, yeah, but that's like that's like a child saying, I don't want to grow up. And I don't mean to sound harsh, but it's like, think about that, right? There are real examples of where significant quantitative expenditure is the only way in which you get the qualitative change that you're seeking. So there's that. Secondly, first of all, if people are interested in, I put all of these things out for free. I did, and during COVID, when I wanted to help, and so I did a daily. I taught meditation, contemplation from the Eastern traditions. I taught some movement practices, and then I went into the Western tradition, and I took people through wisdom practices from the Epicurean tradition, the Stoic tradition, the Neoplatonic tradition. That's all there. We regularly run workshops where we take people through a sequence. They do a meditative practice, a contemplative practice, then they learn some basic circling techniques, and then they learn philosophical fellowship, and then they go into a dialectic practice, dialectic into dialogos. We do those workshops regularly. There are many emerging communities of practices that are creating genuine ecologies of practices for bringing about significant transformation. Like I mentioned, in the summer I was doing Return to the Source with Rafe Kelly's Ecology of Practices, and I read really powerful, challenging, profoundly transformative ecology of practices. There's growing communities and communities of communities. So whoever I'm speaking to, there are lots of resources out there that you can make use of in order to find a community that is supporting and homing an ecology of practices that will bring about the transformation that is needed. So that's how you do it. And people will say things like, well, but like so much time. It's like, again, like after you get past utilization deficiency, this is when you're first starting to take on something. It's an additional thing in your schedule. It's disruptive. You're not doing it very well. It interferes with everything else. That's a thing. And you have to push through that. And that's where a community of people who have pushed through that can be really helpful and encourage you. Because once you push past utilization deficiency, these things more than pay for themselves. Mm-hmm. I do not want to go through a day where I have not practiced my practices. Mm-hmm. Like that happens sometimes periodically because of like I'm flying and I move through time zones and I lose the time and I'm suddenly having to go right from one day to the next without having and you know, yeah, there's jet lag, but sometimes it's also flying in not so much of the time zones, just the length of the flight, or when I'm sick, like physically sick, and I can't do very much. Right now, I've hurt my hip, so I miss my practices because of I can feel the quality of all of my cognition going down when my practices aren't there. I miss my practices the way I miss one of my best friends because of the way they open me to the world, encourage me, empower me, correct me, and people who are not doing it, they won't believe me precisely because the propositions won't convince you, because this is not ultimately something that works at the propositional level.
Yeah, in college, I never took a class before noon. I had one class, but at 11. It's the earliest class I ever took. I was always just convinced I was a night owl. Would routinely stay up till 4 a.m. Now at 36 and really through what you're saying resonates so much because I crave. Last night, got a week-old newborn, and I'm like, man, this is so perfect. Going to bed at 8:30. Gonna wake up at 5, and by 7 a.m. I'll have done my spiritual reflection. It's about 45 minutes, not very, very long. But that you asked that question in I think episode 7 or 8, where you say Plato and Aristotle talk about developing your character as fundamental
Yes.
to your life. How much time, a week, a day, a year, are you deliberately choosing to develop your character? And me at 26 would have been, none. John, that was when I was, 13, 14, 15. It's set and in complete, flying in the face of everything you're saying right now, of thinking, at 26, I'm an adult, the character is formed, instead of it's the first thing I do in the morning. And to your point, it's like not eating if I don't do that. It's And then by 7 a.m., I end up inbox zero, to-do list zero. I had one of my closest friends, and it's so great that you also described it as being like, is time with your best friend, is that a waste? Is that in the way of your life? But it's one of my closest friends asked me what's the best advice I ever got, and I told him a sleep doctor told me wake up every morning at the same time, and that really helped me start to wake up early. And he liked the first part of like wake up every morning at the same time to set your 24-hour circadian rhythm, but he was like, dude, everyone says wake up early, and I was like, what do you mean? I don't know what you're talking about. And he's like, you just hear all kinds of old people say wake up early, gotta wake up early, and I actually hadn't really heard that as like a trope, but then 2 weeks later, I shit you not, sent me a text. He said, dude, when I wake up before 8, I feel like I'm twice as productive.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't believe within 2 weeks, he's just, I don't know, an hour earlier seems to have given him that space. To what you're saying, something that you feel like it could get in the way of your productivity or your rhythm that you currently have, ends up being the thing that unlocks that potential that's latent within you.
I agree. I mean, I try to say, as long as if I'm practicing less than the amount of time I'm spending on my cell phone, then I can't justify spending that. I can't criticize spending that much time on my spiritual practices. It's like, well, oh man, I'm spending like 2 hours, and then I look, and how much are you spending on your cell phone every day, and how much of that can you honestly say is productive? And so I think, I always have a lot. There's time available. I can, if I need to, I can take time away from that and put it into this, because again, we obviously have to use these tools. I'm not saying that, but increasing evidence that screen time is largely deleterious to our mental health, things like that, and we have to do it. But there's time you can do that is nurturative to your mental health, and even to your existential health, and so just counterbalance it in your mind. That's one way I try to think about it and frame it. It's like, I'm willing to commit this much time to a practice that reliably is not that productive. It has more to do with sort of nebulous being, nebulous staying in touch with reality, which seems, I don't know if cell phones really do that at all, but we've got very good evidence that they're deleterious to us. You mentioned your nephew going on YouTube and won't play the guitar now. Like we have an entire generation of young women who are punishing themselves because they're trying to live up to Instagram and TikTok presentations of how women should be beautiful or what kind of life you should be living, and and it's all bullshit, right? It's causing depression, it's causing anxiety.
Tells you don't belong in the arena.
That's right. And so think about time where you get better at cutting through the bullshit so that you can significantly ameliorate. I'm just giving one thing here. There's many things I could say, but you have to be on social media. I get it, totally. You have to be on social media. We all do, right? But it's very deleterious. You need to spend other time when you're cultivating how to cut through that bullshit, not only for you, but for your kids or your friends. Because the degree to which you're not challenging that bullshit is the degree to which it's making their lives degrade and having a deleterious impact on them.
There's so much in there, especially for parenting. But because of time, I wanted to ask you a few things that, and almost kind of rapid fire. Lex touched on this with you when he went through the list of philosophers and one-liners for each, but I wish he had really stuck to it, because you go through in such great detail, as great of detail as an hour episode can give in the 50 episodes of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. But this would be even maybe the Cliff's Notes of those one episodes for a handful of these philosophers that have had such a crazy, they've been lighthouses for us as humanity for hundreds of, and some of them thousands of years. But I also want to ask you two things before we get to that. One is you will talk about romanticism as bullshit, romantic bullshit. You mentioned bullshit just then, cutting through the bullshit. What do you mean by romantic bullshit? And then I want to ask you something about Meister Eckhart after that.
Oh, excellent. I look forward to that. So romanticism, we have to understand, romanticism is actually a philosophical movement. And there was a lot that was good about romanticism, but romanticism has become very decadent in our culture. And we even call it romantic love, indicating how much the romantics convinced us that they were right about love. And the problem with that is that leads us to try and make our romantic relationships perform all of the functions that used to be performed by community, history, tradition, religion, philosophy, mythology. And we turn to this person and we say, you're going to do all of that for me. You're going to be the entire source of meaning in life for me, or at least the most significant source. And what we do is we try and make that person carry that weight. And they can't. And so we get the paradox that people say that the thing that they will contribute most to their meaning in life is their romantic relationship. And what has caused them the most suffering in their life is their romantic relationships. You put those two facts together, just put them together, and it shows you the degree of self-deception that must be at work. And so you get something like the romantic comedy, which is one of the great evils of our society, because it, first of all, it gives you the idea that somehow the cosmos is conspiring to help you find the person you should be with, which is ridiculous. I can have just found, I'm in a great relationship, a wonderful relationship. I can have found the best partner of my life, and that's happening for me. And I step into the street, and a truck hits me and kills me. The truck doesn't swerve or stop because I'm in the middle of this great story, right? We forget that the relationship has to sit within a much more comprehensive understanding. And part of what's going on with that confusion is we are telling people that falling in love, the stage of infatuation, that's the epitome of love. And that's bullshit. You don't think that of your friendship. You don't think, my friendship, the first 4 months of my friendship, that was the epitome of my friendship. You go, that's crazy. The real friendship comes on with time. We really get to know each other, and you really give up the illusion that the world is helping you in your relationship, and the two of you struggle through things and you work on things, and you know all that, and then you drop all of that away when you turn to your romantic relationship, right? If you're following this decadent romanticism. And so it leads people to unrealistic expectations, and it gives them a wrong model. Look, love is not a feeling. It's not the feeling of excitement or infatuation. Love isn't even an emotion. That's a mistake. If I love someone, that can make me angry, sad, happy, jealous, concerned. Love is an existential stance. It's that reciprocally binding yourself to another person, that participatory knowing, reciprocally open. You open to them, they open to you, like profound friendship. Right? It's an existential stance. So romanticism has taught us to misunderstand love as a feeling or an emotion. It has taught us to think of love as infatuation, which is ridiculous. It has taught us to think of our romantic relationship as being the equivalent to religion and history and culture and philosophy. It's ridiculous. And it's taught us that when we are doing this, somehow it was meant to happen. There was destiny, which is also ridiculous, because that all of those things will actually crush a real relationship from taking root, and it will also lead people to be devastated when the relationship ends, because they don't understand the reality of human relationships.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about the fact that when I was 13, 14, I couldn't wait to get married. I think I bought this wholesale, that's when I will self-actualize, when I find that person.
Yep.
And obviously, you have the Jerry Maguire, you complete me type of
Yes.
fallacy. And it flies in the face of great relationship advice coming from Charlie Munger, one of the best investors of all time, who basically said, if you want to get a good spouse, deserve a good spouse. And
Yes.
And it's almost the reverse of develop yourself so fully that you deserve a great spouse, instead of that spouse is going to, that person, that partner, that romantic interest is going to actualize to get the person that you ultimately want first, rather than through that relationship.
And also, I think that's great advice. I would temper it with, and you might not find anybody for a very long time. Like take that seriously. And then of course there's, like I said, and then we've made it worse with, we've got a modal confusion. We confuse having sex with being in love. That's a profound confusion as well. That's an existential confusion. So there's a lot of ways in which romantic love is bullshit for us. Now, what I'm not saying that a profound love that has a sexual component in it is not possible between human beings. Obviously it is. What I'm saying is, if you frame it according to that decadent romanticism, you're liable to strangle it or not succeed in it. If you adopt, I would offer, a Socratic, Platonic, Aristotelian model of how you should understand deep love, then you are much more likely to succeed in it.
I want to quickly touch on something that you briefly mentioned in the lecture series. And by the way, for listeners, as John's mentioned, there's many free resources on YouTube of great lecture series of his and with others. The one that I really got sucked into was Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Especially, I think there was a thought dancing in the back of my head from Joseph Campbell of just, we're the first non-traditional societies in the world. Mm-hmm. Just, we do not have shared traditions. I don't know if my next door neighbors celebrate even Christmas. That 30, 40 years ago would have been maybe a foregone conclusion that I would at least know. Now I have no idea, much less, and that's, once a year, much less any other traditions that we might share. And him saying we're free falling into the future. And so that's why that series was so beautiful to discover, with that as the backdrop of, wow, shit, we're collectively, it does feel like we're free falling into the future. But at the same time, it does also feel like we are awakening. So I highly encourage listeners to go check out the series. But one phrase nestled into the episodes that I was craving more information from you on is, you talk about Meister Eckhart, beautiful mind that we have very scant, we do not discuss. We have very little insight into his life, but this quote, life without a why, or living without a why. Could you go into what is meant by live a life without a why, when especially the backdrop culturally is your purpose, your why, like that's the thing to discover before you can ever act. You've got to figure that out. Could you talk to us about what he meant by that?
Yeah. So first of all, two things. One, to help him with some current cognitive science, there's four things that are predictive of meaning in life. One of them is purpose, but it's not the most important. Other things are intelligibility, sort of significance, how real your experiences are, but mattering, how much you are connected to something beyond yourself. So a good way to find those things is, I ask people this question: what do you want to exist even if you don't? That's the things that matter. And you, right, and the degree to which you commit to their existence, and you want to, right, not how are they relevant to you, but how you matter to them. Iris Murdoch said, love is the recognition that something other than yourself is real. People talk, Susan Wolf in her book, Meaning in Life and What It Matters, people talk about wanting to be connected to something bigger than themselves. But what they mean is something that has an existence and a value beyond their egocentric existence. So first of all, purpose, I'm not denying purpose, but it's a failure of our culture to try and collapse everything into purpose. That's the first thing. The second is, when you are doing something for something else, the thing you're doing only has an instrumental value. You're doing X in order to get to Y. And so the X only has an instrumental value. And if you think, for example, that your reason is only instrumental, it's only for getting you to a certain place. And if you think of your reason as being a fundamental feature of you, then you're saying that you are only instrumentally valuable. You're only valuable insofar as people and things can use you to get to their goals, because you have identified purely with instrumentality. You want to do things that are not done to get to something else. You want to do things that have an inherent value in them. The reason why you're doing them is because you're doing them. The value of doing them is in doing them, right? And it's not only in doing, it's being. Right. This is the idea. If I'm virtuous in order to get people's regard, then I haven't understood virtue. Virtue is its own reward. You're mature for the sake of being mature, right? And think about the things that you really feel make you most alive, most connected, most present. Maybe it's listening to music. You just sink into the music and you're absorbed into it. Why are you listening to the music? What's the goal? What's the purpose of listening to the music? What's the why of that? And if you give any answer to that, you actually don't care about the music. The music is only in service of the thing you care about. So Eckhart wants you to get to a place where all of your life is like listening to music, or making love to somebody that you really love, or engaging in a conversation for its own sake. That's what it is to live without a why. Because if everything is for the purpose, then everything that you use to get to that purpose has no inherent value. You've actually devalued all of those things. And then the problem is, what happens when you get your purpose? What happens when you achieve it? You better hope that where that state you get in, there's a lot of inherent value in it for you, or you're doomed, because now you have no purpose, and that was the only thing giving you meaning in life. And the problem is, if you do that, you have practiced instrumentalizing and not finding inherent value, so that when you achieve your purpose, and you no longer have a purpose that you're searching for, you don't have very much skill or virtue for savoring the depths of inherent value. That's what Eckhart meant.
It's relevant to the last topic on romantic bullshit, or romantic love being the end-all, be-all actualization event. Sounds like what you're saying is, and what he's alluding to, at least in that area code, is if you make someone else, a partner, instrumental value, reduce them to a instrument of what you really want, then you negate that person, or you negate their value.
That's right. And you will also become instrumental in that relationship. You will, Han talks about this. You will more and more be exploiting yourself as an instrument.
Mm.
And that is a disaster. That's a disaster for a human being, right? The like loving, look, we talk about erotic love and friendship, but agapic love, the love of your parent, the love you have, you don't love your child because they're a great friend, the way, they reciprocate and help you out and all that. Like, they're 1 week old, they can't do any, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you love them, and you love them profoundly. I've had kids too, right? I have them still, but I had them when they were little, right? You love them because that's agapic love. It's not, you're not consuming, you're not cooperating, you're creating a person. That's the point. Like, this agapic love is like a miracle. It's like, if I could love my couch, I could turn it into a Ferrari or something. Like, you love this creature you bring home from the hospital, and it turns into a person capable of language and cognition and creativity and love and connected. Like, this is astonishing. If you love your child wisely, you will turn them into a person, a full person with moral agency. That's why you do it. Agapic love is not consumptive it's not cooperative, it's creative. You're creating something, and it matters to you. Why? Because persons are inherently valuable. And so you're creating something that's inherently valuable. That's why agapic love is so profound. Right? And of course, Eckhart's a Christian, and Christianity is all about agapic love. And that's what he was trying to convey to people, that you want to get to a place where you're living as agapically as possible.
I love your definitions of things, and that instrumental value is beautiful. It's so phenomenal that truth is not in words; it's an experience, at least from my perspective. And yet, these sounds we make from our mouths in the right way can click us into something that feels like experience. And maybe it is just insight, and the ability to then say, oh, now I have that clickability for others. In that articulation, so instrumental value is one of the things that, and I was a full-on just principal actor in this in 10 years in San Francisco, Silicon Valley. But one of my critiques in Silicon Valley was that every interaction I had was with someone on their way to somewhere else, and that
instrumental,
right? And that was that coffee, that job, that interview, the fundraising meeting, whatever it was just all of us just passing in the night, ships passing in the night, all trying to get somewhere else, except for that interaction. And every facade, every savvy social maneuver, still just covering that veneer on that core to that interaction, and it reduced me into instruments for others. But it's certainly something that I missed growing up in Texas, where you certainly would see other people as resources in many respects, but it was far less to a Machiavellian degree as a hard-charging Silicon Valley epicenter was.
When one is facing their mortality and their death, it's only the connections to inherent value that will matter to you. I promise you that. And many of you who are listening might not believe me. But if there's one thing you believe about what I've said, believe that. Believe that.
I'll mention another articulation that you said. Well, I love the definition you gave for friendship. Friendship being accelerating mutual disclosure.
Yes.
Phenomenal definition to think through. Is someone a friend or not? And are you accelerating that mutual disclosure or not? It's great for spouses and partners and this romantic.
It's the opposite of addiction, right? Addiction is reciprocal narrowing. This is Mark Lewis's work.
Oh,
We
wow.
narrow down, we reciprocal, and I said this to Mark. I said to him, but if we can reciprocally narrow in addiction, certainly we can reciprocally open, and that's platonic friendship, right? And Mark was like, "Oh, right, of course. It's the opposite of addiction when you reciprocally open."
That is beautiful. That's a lot for many of us to think about when it comes to relationships with people. Which direction is it going? Okay, could we go through the list of philosophers and get your one-liners on them? Just a handful. But if we're to take away one anchor point from them to navigate the world as a creator, as a leader, as a community member, Socrates.
He said it best: the unexamined life is not worth living.
Plato.
You are always finite transcendence. You can transcend, but you never transcend your finitude. If you pay attention to just your finitude, you become a servant. If you pay attention to just your transcendence, you become a tyrant.
Aristotle.
Cultivate your character more than anything else you do.
Which is why that question landed so well in one of your episodes where you said, how much time do you spend each day cultivating your character? Buddha.
After he experienced enlightenment, he was walking down the road and he was greeted by men and they said, "Are you a god?" And he said, "No." "Are you a divine messenger?" "No." "Are you a prophet?" "No." "Well, are you just then a man?" "No." "What are you then?" "I am awake."
Christ.
Try to love other people agapically.
To see their development. To miraculously contribute
Help them
to
be
their
born
development.
again. Right?
Say that again.
If you agapically love people, you're helping them to be born again, to go through those profound transformations that you and I were talking about.
Contribute to their transformation and development. Augustine.
Augustine. What would I say? Augustine's interesting because there's so many things that are sort of equally salient for me. Yeah, he said it once, and I think this is really good. Love God and then do whatever you want. But first love God.
Wow. All right, next up, I think you are our foremost Neo-Platonist, but the OG Neoplatonist, Plotinus.
Learn how to become one with ultimate reality.
Aquinas. Your reason and your spirituality don't have to be separate. They actually are interwoven. Descartes.
Descartes. Yeah, so mostly I talk about Descartes' mistakes. But what's something that's really important about Descartes? Try to get your thinking to be as clear, to be made up of clear and distinct ideas as you possibly can.
Luther.
Luther's a hard one for me because he's sort of the villain in
Actually, maybe articulate one of those thoughts that goes through your mind when you say, okay, he's kind of a villain in the awakening towards meaning. What did he get wrong that we
Luther,
cling to?
what I think he got wrong was the idea that faith is the assertion of belief.
Kant.
And it's part of the propositional tyranny that we're in now. Kant. I mean, there's stuff in Kant that it's never treat people as means only, but as ends in themselves. People are never to be understood, including yourself, as purely instrumental in nature.
That's going to be so powerful for people to listen to in this podcast, because so much of Silicon Valley is built around optimizing yourself, like sharpening a tool. And to your point, you relegate yourself to a tool. That's why a lot of founders become tools. Hegel.
Realize that distributed cognition, collective intelligence, has a life of its own and a history of its own, and it is unfolding in a way that requires careful study and understanding.
Talk about a great counterpoint to propositional knowledge, that distributed cognition has nothing to do with knowing, knowing a fact, but having 100 set of eyes looking out for you. Heidegger.
Your being is the kind of being that can have its being called into question. That's what makes you fundamentally what you are.
The last two, Corbin.
The imaginal is absolutely central to a wise and flourishing life.
Taking care of the you that's 10 years down the road. Jung.
The relationship, the vertical relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, is as important as the horizontal relationship between consciousness and the world.
Speaking of Vedanta, he never gave. I learned this from you. I think I heard you correctly that he never gave real credit to others that he was influenced by. I think Corbin being an example, and then also the Vedas or Vedanta. If I heard you correctly.
Yeah, he doesn't give enough. He does give credit, but it's not enough. He should give more credit to Corbin. He should definitely give more credit to Vedanta. His notion of the ego and the self is very much like the relationship, between Atman and Brahman in Vedanta, things like that. Or his notion of the self corresponds to the Vedanta notion of Atman. In fact, I wish he'd used that word rather than self, because people misunderstand it a lot. He could have given more credit. There was part of it is he's discovering a lot, and his internal dialogue was really central to him. Part of it is he's in deep competition with Freud, and so that is dominating him in some ways. I see Corbin talking a lot more about Jung than I see Jung talking about Corbin, just as an example.
I remember you saying that. I've read a lot of Jung over the years and never heard him really mention Corbin, if that's a correct pronunciation. But to your lecture, when I started to read Corbin, he talks about Jung quite often. And I think you even mentioned they would meet quite regularly.
Yeah, the Uranus conference and stuff like that, yes.
Well, Dr. Vervaeke, I couldn't ask any more from you, especially in that last, that was a phenomenal overview of the last 2,500 years of phenomenal
I'm
philosophers.
worried about being pretentious about that. I tried my best.
No, that was I put you to the test, and we had 5 minutes to go through them, and you did it wonderfully. Thank you. That's going to be a lot for us to chew on for many years. I'm going to have to re-listen to this episode multiple times and really digest, maybe like we were saying, 5 minutes at a time to really reflect, because we all know listening in one ear, out the other. I can't thank you enough. John, thank you so much for the time, the generosity of insight and time. And I also, I really recommend people just diving into episode 1, just to see what would be in store for the incredibly, I cannot believe that it's free, Awakening, the Meaning Crisis. It is just, I'll link to it, and I really highly recommend people diving into it. There's so much beauty there, and the way you teach is it's powerful. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I really enjoyed this conversation, and you asked some amazing questions. Like I said, one of them was one of the best questions I've ever been asked. So it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, as you've said it best, questing and not questioning. This topic is not.
Yes.
It's not for propositional purposes.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you, John. Looking forward to maybe a part 2 down the road.
I would be happy to talk to you again, James.